Okay, thank you for your kind words. I'd also like to welcome everyone here this evening, both in the theatre and those who are joining us through those magical online living or streaming technologies. Thank you to members of the faculty who are here, my friends and colleagues, particularly members I've noticed from the Language and Literacy Faculty Research Group. It's important, and I thank you for your presence here this evening. But also to the teachers who are here with us and those working in primary schools. Teachers and young children are very much at the heart of my work, and so I hope this lecture resonates with your thinking and practice. And I'd also like to acknowledge a number of key people. Firstly, Professor Bridie Rabin, who's travelled from Mildura to be here tonight. Bridie has been a mentor in really the truest sense of the word, and a colleague and advocate of my work for over 20 years. But the extraordinary breadth and depth of Bridie's work in early language and literacy continues to surprise and challenge me. And I have with me tonight, last Thursday, Bridie presented me with a very special reading cup. So I have that with me tonight, and thank you, Bridie, for being here. I'd also like to acknowledge Dame Professor Murray Clay, who was integral to my understanding of literacy as a complex process and issues of equity and access. And I count myself as extremely fortunate to have known and have worked with Murray Clay. And also Professor Joseph Lobianco, a constant source of support and inspiration. So to commence with the content of tonight's talk, I'd like to consider ways of defining writing that conceptualise and frame aspects of my research. In the broadest sense, writing is about text production, and we need to recognise the multiple modes of expression young children use as they engage with digital texts, both with current and expanding forms of technology. And while it's very tempting to use a common sense definition of writing as producing and inscribing words, our understandings of multimodality require us to consider writing as text creation and production that actually goes beyond linguistic understandings to include multiple modes of expression. However, that said, for many children in the early years, and within our current curriculum frameworks, written text, drawing on language or linguistic representations of meaning, remains central to the many multimodal forms of text that children use. In this way, success with written language is important in its own right, and this is where much of my work around writing has focused. So with this as a caveat and perhaps a recognition of this as a narrowing space for discussion this evening. I'm also positioning this talk within an understanding of writing as a complex process. Of all language and communication activities, writing is the most complex and for many children the most difficult. As highlighted in our national testing data, our own NAPLAN results show students' performance levels in writing below that of reading and other modes or literacy modes measured. Possibly or perhaps because as Professor Lobianco reminds us, writing, like speaking, involves the most elaborate manifestation of language to communicate messages to others. And this difference may lie in the distinctions between receptive and expressive meaning-making modes. So not only the most difficult and elaborate forms of expression, but as Brandt claims, in the current era, writing has come of age, possibly eclipsing reading as the literate experience of consequence. As we now create texts as often, if not more often, than we read, making the teaching of writing a high priority for teachers. Success with writing has also been linked to learning and literacy more generally, linked to academic success in school, and is needed to fulfil many of the roles in adulthood. With writing, and particularly handwritten texts, still part of high-stakes examinations and gatekeeping processes, and it's often the way we are assessed on what we know. And an appreciation of early writing and what this means for our youngest learners. We often underestimate the complexity of the process for young writers. Myhill and Fisher describe writing as effortful activity at all ages, and for many of us, we continue to be challenged by the demands of writing. When learning to write, young children need to master motor skills, coordinate thinking and memory, moving from the ideas of composing to recording to editing texts. And this learning takes both time, support, and also patience. Also sobering is the thought that for very young children, they can spend up to 50% of their day writing in schools. And for those who find learning to write difficult, of course, they're further disadvantaged in our school systems. And considering research into early writing, despite the recognised challenges, policy and research concerning literacy have in the main neglected the role of early writing, instead focusing almost exclusively on oral language development and reading and the resources to support these areas. Colleagues from Ohio State University, led by Emily Rogers, recently reported, given its importance, it's somewhat surprising that we know very little, comparatively speaking, about how early writing development proceeds. Indeed, descriptions of literacy development are much more coherent and diverse in terms of early and skilled reading development than early and skilled writing development. Noting also the work of Tolchinsky, there's a critical gap in the extant research about early writing development that occurs between the period when children are learning to put words together into sentences, when they produce coherent texts or move into conventional literacy, and this typically being in the first 2 years of school. And just when you thought that was enough, early literacy is a highly contested space, as evidenced by recent moves to introduce the Year 1 phonics test. Now, phonics is, of course, absolutely central and critical to early reading and writing. However, debate continues over the pedagogy and practice that best support young children in this area. So tonight, I plan to share with you a number of research studies that I've been involved in, all of which have their basis in the analysis of children's texts to contribute to building a stronger picture of what we know about young children's writing and to support teaching and learning. Okay. Now, the first project that I was involved in that specifically looked at children's writing was the work around the Oxford word list. So I worked with Professor Joe Lobianco, Dr. Deborah Ives, and staff from Oxford University Press. This research aimed to discover things like what can we learn from the words that students write in their earliest samples of writing? What can we infer from their word selections that children make, or what influences them? Influences such as gender, family backgrounds, ethnic and linguistic diversity, or their place of residence. Further, what do students' word choices tell teachers about the teaching of reading and of writing? To work with this research, we collected 3,776 texts from children in the first 3 years of school. 5 texts from children who are in prep or their foundation year in South Australia. 3 samples from children in the 2nd and 3rd year of school. Importantly, on topics children wanted to write about. And what did we learn? Firstly, we learned from their writing that regardless of children's backgrounds, they write with a fairly common vocabulary. They write words, of course, that their peers will understand and therefore are considered a discourse community or a community of communication. And this shared vocabulary was evident at 2 cut points, the top 20 and the top 50 words. It was only beyond these thresholds when we started to look at the first 100, 200 and 300 words that indicators of difference became more apparent. Differences in terms of gender and probable differences in socio-cultural experience, as well as the personal, imaginative and creative capabilities of individual children. This suggests the need for an essential core of vocabulary for all young children that then permits meaningful difference to emerge. The differences can be identified in the online word list. This word list, and it can be quite addictive if you're sitting at home, putting in different cohorts and seeing what comes out, allows you to examine or to build a foundational word list, or to build the foundational word list, or then expand students' repertoire around vocabulary. For example, the words displayed here are for males in Year 2 from English-speaking backgrounds in a rural or regional community, and the words that they tend to write. So hideout, bullies, perhaps, chasing. But I also noted on this word list the word bus. Many of these children, of course, might use a bus or catch the bus in terms of travelling to school. And of course you can switch the categories around and show different word lists for different student groups. More generally, when we look across the cohort groups, we see persistent and significant differences, particularly for gender. So this shows you some of the top word choices for students used by boys and girls across their 300 words. Girls used a wider range of gendered nouns, such as auntie. I'm very pleased that auntie was there. Fairy, girl, girls, prince and princess, all included in their writing, obviously in this apparent generic sort of fantasy field. The word witch never mentioned by boys, and the only similar noun used exclusively by boys was king. Gendered experience also marked pronoun reference. If you can have a look at words like her, him, he, she on that word list and compare the number or the frequency used by boys and the frequency used by girls. Girls refer to males more often than, girls refer to females, of course, more often than males, but girls showed a more equitable use of pronouns, with he occurring 621 times in their texts and she 910 times. We can also compare by location, and again we see differences in gender in the rural sample. Motorbike appearing for boys and horse appearing for girls. Could possibly be pony for our young girls. The word lists also indicated that while rural children often write about the weekend, our urban children refer to Saturday and Sunday. And if your families are anything like mine, the girls often tell me, Janet, we're very busy on a Saturday, with a distinct difference from Saturday and Sunday. And in respect to consumption, there's a markedly less frequent use of bought in the rural sample than the urban children use. We were also able to look at generational change, and the point of this is that perhaps a newer word list might also find continuing change in written word usage. We were able to compare the Oxford word list to the Salisbury word list collected in South Australia at the end of 1978 and into 1979. There's the intriguing presence of consumerism in the more recent list and a greater awareness and interest in food. So words such as bought, new, shop, shops, want, wanted, eat, ate, cake, dinner, fish and food, not appearing in the Salisbury list from 1978. There was also the notable extension of a range of words to describe viewing. So that in 2007, children wrote see, saw, watched, movie, TV, compared to the more limited range of see and saw in 1979. And the two lists also provide evidence of an expanded range of leisure activities for children. The newest sample including ball, bike, football, park, played, playing, soccer, swimming, birthday party, fun, games and one. And in the Oxford word list, there were fewer references to mother and father, although they did share a consistent use of mum and dad. And this goes along with the diminished use of titles, Mr. and Mrs. We always referred to adults as Mr. and Mrs., even if we were using their first name as young children, reinforcing the possibility of a more general decline in expected formality. So the point of sharing this research is to illustrate the need to identify and connect with the kinds of capital knowledge and cultural and linguistic resources that are valued in the community and that children bring to our classrooms. It's important that teaching acknowledges this relationship, and draws on a common pool of linguistic competence as children learn to read and also to write. And it's been these descriptions of linguistic competence that has predicated the research that I've been working on since 2010, drawing on the current breadth of experience children bring to their engagement with writing. So, the next piece of research I want to share with you gives insight into students' writing abilities. This work was conducted with Noella Mackenzie from Charles Sturt University, Terence Bowles from the University of Melbourne, and Lynn Munsey from the Department of Education and Community, New South Wales. Working with a multidisciplinary team, we began an area looking at 3 areas of investigation. The first was, what does Year 1 students' writing look like? At the end of Term 2 and the end of Term 4 in New South Wales and Victoria, and we considered aspects such as the length of the text, spelling, vocabulary, text structure, ideas and handwriting. We also considered a sample, if it is a sample of writing, collected at the point of discontinuing from reading recovery, reflective of an average level when placed on a continuum of Year 1 writing. Now, you might think that's a rather odd research question, but Noella, Lynn Munsey and myself have all been very much engaged in the implementation of reading recovery. And our third question, is the quality of writing collected at the end of reading recovery a reliable predictor of ongoing success in literacy as measured by national or the NAPLAN writing assessment in Year 3? So we collected data from Catholic Education Melbourne and New South Wales Department of Education Community Schools. For our Year 1 data set, we have 3,193 texts collected from 1,799 students. And I often think about that number and wonder, why couldn't we get just one more? It would be much easier to say 1,800 children. But 1,799 students collected at 2 points in time, mid-year July, August, and the end of year November, December. For our reading recovery data set, we collected samples from 314 students. We also collected their writing vocabulary task, and we were able to track 277 of these students to their Year 3 NAPLAN results. So, many texts, a database of over 300 texts. So we have a very large sample to draw from. The challenge then became one of analysis. So after looking at existing tools and even trying to retrofit the NAPLAN marking guides to our analysis, we decided to use an initial sample of text to develop our own framework for analysis. Nothing quite fitted in the way we needed it to or wanted it to. Over a number of months, we worked with 210 texts, and the research team worked towards consensus around the dimensions of writing that were of interest or important and levels of progression evident in the samples. We were able to identify text structure, sentence structure and vocabulary, spelling, punctuation and handwriting, legibility, as areas of interest, and looking at the progressions, we were able to sequence the text into 6 levels of attainment. And then we asked teachers who had supplied the samples to us to further inform the validity of the measure and the reliability of our ratings. And this is what actually led to the publishing of the tool. When Noella, Lynn and I shared the data with teachers, as well as their somewhat interest in our findings, they were more often asking if they could have copies of the tool to use in their schools. What sets this tool aside, I guess, from others is that it reflects or was originated from children's linguistic competence. The dimensions and the progression sequence grew out of our work with young children's texts. So it's not something that was imposed on the writing as an assessment standard to be achieved. And we make this very clear that it's not an assessment tool, but it is rather what children in Year 1 can do and can be used for the purpose of analysis. And teachers saw this as an integrated writing system that provided instructionally relevant multi-factor data so that they were then better equipped to pinpoint children's development and respond to their strengths and needs accordingly. The writing analysis tool is now online, and I did try and do it before, but I'm not going to do it now. You can actually, in any device, just place in Writing Analysis Tool, Charles Sturt University, and the tool is readily available to you. And if you've got devices with you, I don't mind if you actually pop that in now and you can have a play. We came up with 6 dimensions and 6 levels of progression in terms of the tool. Following Peterson Smith and other researchers from the UK, we referred to text structure, sentence structure and vocabulary as authorial aspects of writing, and spelling, punctuation and handwriting as secretarial dimensions. So this is where it comes to the advantage of working in a multidisciplinary team. Dr. Terry Bowles was able to complete the statistical analysis that showed there was a clear evidence of text structure, sentence structure and vocabulary as dimensions of writing associated with the authorial aspect. Similarly, spelling, punctuation and handwriting associated with the secretarial aspects of writing. So starting from the analysis of young students' text, the dimensions captured in the writing analysis tool can be used to illustrate these early aspects of writing with some accuracy and confidence. So then returning to our research question, now that we have a tool to measure students' writing, What does Year 1 writing look like? And this table presents the frequency count for students' level of attainment at times 1 and 2 for each of the dimensions and the levels of progression achieved. It's probably easier. Well, first of all, the table actually shows the wide level of attainment, and if you do look on the writing analysis tool online and click those examples that are there for you, you do actually see the levels of progression from 1 to 6 across each of the dimensions of writing. We were able to use the tool to comment on where were student strengths overall and what dimensions might need further focused attention relative to the total cohort. However, it might be best to illustrate what children can do by looking at their texts. You get quite good at reading children's writing after a while, if you can work it out. So this one is, on the weekend, Dad went to the moon. First he bought a rocket, it cost $1 million. Then he got home and put the rocket at the back on the grass. Next he went in the rocket, then he flew into space. Finally he got to the moon, he played golf there, he said it was fun. Then we had dinner, it was a fun day. Okay, evidence of the linguistic structure and features of a recount. We have the orientation and we have use of temporal connectives. So after 18 months to 2 years of school, this is the type of text that most of the children were able to produce. When we think about sentence structure, we have evidence that the majority of students have control over simple and compound sentences with adverbial phrases to show both when and where. So we have where, in a little cottage, when, one day. In terms of vocabulary use, most of the students by the end of Year 1 or in the second half of Year 1 had moved beyond using everyday words to using a range of vocabulary that included topic-specific words and possibly even more sophisticated vocabulary. This is one of my favourite texts with the 3,000 halo troopers. They landed on Earth. They protected... Sorry, my eyesight's quite bad, I have to turn this way. They protected it from the forces of evil. The halos were vastly outnumbered, but they fought back anyway. But in the end, the halos killed all the enemies. Thinking about spelling, punctuation and handwriting, what can Year 1 students do, or what do most Year 1 students do? We can see patterns of spelling across the 4 texts that I've shown tonight. Again, here we see very plausible attempts at spelling using phonic knowledge and consistent use of 2, 3 and 4 letter high-frequency words. We also see what was very common in our sample, or our text sample, that many of the students were able to use or had some use of capital letters and full stops. And for handwriting and legibility, correct letter formations, regularity of size, position and spacing of words and letters. Of course, when teachers map their own students' writing, different patterns emerge that capture individual students' growth and development. We were also interested, we had samples from 2 points in time. We were also interested in the patterns or the different dimensions of growth over that period of time. And what was most surprising here was the increase in percentage growth in the authorial aspects of writing for children from English backgrounds or children learning English as an additional language. And this possibly reflecting the reciprocity of language and literacy learning for these young children. This reminds me of a quote from Marie Clay. If we harness the power of children's oral language to literacy learning from the beginning, so that literacy knowledge and oral language processing power move forward together, patterned and linked from the start, that would surely be more powerful. Thinking about the questions that were related to children in reading recovery. I haven't included all the reading recovery text analysis in the presentation this evening, aside from the data that looked at the relationships or growth towards NAPLAN. And we start to think about factors or the correlations of interest from children's writing in Year 1 to their development in Year 3. And just as mileage and stamina impact on children's reading, this may also play out in terms of children's writing. Those who produce more sophisticated texts, wrote more, facilitated by an ease of handwriting, achieved in the higher NAPLAN bands at Year 3, as also shown in the correlations on the right-hand side of the table. So here, the message seems to be linking both quantity and quality in the early years of schooling as a basis for future learning. Since the publication of the tool, new areas of research have opened up. What the team of researchers and I have been working on most recently is the analysis of texts for teaching, and how teachers might use the writing tool in this area of their work to assess writing, to inform teaching, and also to support decision-making around how understanding how the dimensions of writing work together to reflect skill profiles of students that might then connect to classroom approaches to teaching. And then also with this link to small group teaching, that's both purposeful and focused. So we looked at skill profiles. We had a high, middle and a low group, 3 distinct groups of writings when we classified or coded the data. A high group of students that were achieving quite well in terms of the authorial and the secretarial dimensions of writing. An average or mid group of students who were quite good authorially, but not as strong in terms of the secretarial aspects. So they had the ideas, but had difficulty transcribing those ideas in text. And a low group of readers who were low across secretarial and authorial aspects of writing. There's a challenge here. And the challenge is, I think, to maintain the middle group's attention to meaning making while building transcription skills, but also to provide rich context for learning that engage the lower group of students in meaning making processes, while also developing their secretarial skills to communicate their messages. And we looked at skill profiles in relation to gender and also SES. The data from this study suggests that outcomes specific to gender may not be as relevant to students in the early years of schooling, with greater differences developing later on, with the exception of vocabulary that appears to be of concern for boys. And I think there is some further work needed to see if this area is more critical than others in terms of a predictor for later writing. The general patterns for the 3 SES groups showed that the above average group separated from the other 2 groups with relatively consistent and significant differences. However, and I think this is quite important, the magnitude of difference for SES was not as strong as the difference between the naturally occurring clusters. So our lowest writers were not necessarily from our lowest SES cohort. Thinking about the breadth and depth of teaching, we found that teachers can use the writing analysis tool to consider a wider lens when teaching writing. In a small study, a sub-study rather, of 3 schools and 8 teachers, we asked teachers to use the tool to analyse a sample of writing and then record a teaching conversation with the student. And here's one example, with the text first and the analysis apparent, and the analysis here showing the apparent strengths in terms of text structure and vocabulary. So the conversation that followed. The teacher focused on the students' ideas. What's one of your ideas about lions? That you don't go near them because they could chase you? That's a very good idea. Have you got that in your writing though? No? Well, you could add that if you wanted to add some more. So a focus on ideas, and the second area that this teacher attended to was vocabulary. And you've got lots of words that tell us about lions. They have sharp teeth. Sharp teeth, yes. So they're words about lions. And you wrote that they howl. What did the lion at the zoo use to scratch the rock? With its claws. Well, claws is another good word you could use when you're writing about lions. So see if you can remember that when you continue your writing next time. Interesting here, and if we think back to the text that the teacher was presented with, the teacher focused on the authorial aspects of writing to build on the students' strengths. And this again was reinforced in the teacher's comments at interview. I think we have to be really careful. Sometimes we just go straight and correct the spelling and put in the full stops, and we don't really have a deep conversation about what the children are trying to say and what the purpose of the writing is and where they're going. A similar comment from the interviews after this small study. I went in with the focus of what I wanted to talk about with them. But sometimes things popped into the conversation, things I wasn't going to discuss, that the child brought up. Talking with children about writing. This study showed us the ways of engaging children in conversations about their texts. When discussing children's writing, teachers purposely identified aspects of the text for discussion, while also providing opportunities for students to contribute to the conversation. Thus, the teaching of writing are reciprocal and responsive to children's interests and engagement. However, we also recognise that many educators continue to be challenged by ways to effectively engage children in rich conversations about their writing. So work on conversations has become central to my most recent work in this area. This study was designed to explore conversations with young children as they engage in early mark making, scribble, drawing and writing in the preschool and in the first year of school. What we know is that parents and educators have high levels of confidence when talking with children during book reading. Nearly everyone can sit a child on their knee, start turning the pages, and they sort of just know what to say. We know less about how we talk with very young children as they draw and write. So for this study, these are our research participants. Children aged between 2, 4 or 5, and we recorded their conversations with an educator researcher as they were drawing and writing. In all sorts of different places, ways, with a range of different tools and materials. One of our participants, aged 4 years and 3 months, and this is part of our the data we have from this study, the photographs and the transcript of the conversation. So the child was asked, "Can you tell me about this?" Well, this is Dad catching butterflies. Is the drawing finished? No, I'm going to draw Dad next. How are you going to draw Dad? I don't know. Later on, can you tell me about your drawing? It's of Dad catching butterflies. And who's this? Mum? And what's this? It's a mouse. Mum is catching a mouse, Dad was catching butterflies, and Mum catching the mice, and she put them in the fire alive. You never know what you're going to get, really. Thinking about the analysis, comments were directed to the tools that the children were using. What would you like to draw with? The topic of the text. What are you going to draw? Possibly even questions about the family. How are you going to draw Dad? Thinking about the task. And then the text that was completed. Can you tell me about this? So this is very preliminary analysis, thinking about conversations with children as they engage in drawing and mark making. Conversations around the tools, the topic, the task and the text. This analysis just begins to inform how we might engage in conversations with young children to mediate and extend their drawings and the meanings they are creating in these texts. Okay. So, based on these studies, I'll draw to a close as I think about 4 distinct messages for practice. The first is around supporting continuities and progressions in children's learning, involving a closer examination of children's early writing and processes that mediate this learning, to address the continuity in their learning, but also to ensure a clear articulation of practices as children transition from home to preschool and into school. The second is about resource allocation. Stuart McNaughton described the early years as critical because children who are working hard to learn how to read and write are at risk of experiencing difficulties that can affect progress in the long term. So we do need to invest in early intervention and programs such as Reading Recovery as a systemic intervention designed to support the lowest achieving students and not necessarily those only in our low SES schools. The third is a better understanding of the writing process. From our studies of young writers, it's now reasonable to expect that we are better able to describe writing development of young children during the first formal years of schooling and the differences between student groups, and we can use that awareness to optimise learning and instruction for writing. And finally, to prioritise early writing as a form of creativity and expression that enables children to connect, interact and communicate. Prioritising early writing in all of our classrooms, but also in our initial teacher education programs. So to conclude, I'd like to thank Professor John Loughran for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. Thank you, John. The marketing and research team, I don't know where they've disappeared to, but particularly Chantal Braganza for organising me for this event. All of my research colleagues, both who are involved in the writing but other programs as well. So my colleagues here at Monash, Jane Kirkby, Julie Faulkner and Damien Lyons. Colleagues at Deakin University that I work with, colleagues from Charles Sturt University and also from the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. And I will single out Terry Bowles as both a research colleague but also for his ongoing professional work and personal care and support. Thank you, Terry. And finally to all of the teachers and children who provided the many texts for analysis. Thank you.
So Janet's done a fantastic job on time, which means we've got a great opportunity for questions.
Oh.
And I think Reggie's carrying a microphone. So if you just sort of put a hand up if you've got a question, and Reggie will get around to you with the microphone, that would be fantastic. I'll just fill in a little bit of time while they think about questions. Reggie, didn't you love the student work? Yeah, I think I had some of that in some papers I've reviewed recently. Bridie, question?
Does this work?
Yeah. You're on.
Does this work?
Yeah.
Janet, I was particularly interested when you took the assessment tool to work with a small group of teachers and their children. And I think that some teachers might find this quite hard to think about in some aspects. And I'm sure you had strategies to help them in. And I think one of the important distinctions you're making there, which is the authorial and the secretarial skills. And if they get that, you know, you can take it that little bit further. Could you just say a little bit more about working with them?
The tool actually as a wide lens, and often Noella and I talk about the tool as providing teachers with a wider lens, because as the teachers themselves said, you know, prior to using the tool, you know, we'd talk about the spelling and the full stops and the capital letters that were missing. Using the tool allowed them to think about the structure and the ideas, the sentences that the students were using, and also, you know, a stronger focus on vocabulary. So I think it was the tool itself that facilitated, first of all, the analysis of the text. So we asked the teachers to analyse the text and then have the conversation with the children. And I think seeing the marked up tool allowed them to go to that conversation with a different lens or a different frame for the conversation with the child. But I think having both authorial and secretarial there in front of you means I really can't ignore both or either at any one time. But where I make decisions, or the decisions that teachers make, were important as well.
Thank you. And I forgot to say early on that there are about 40 or 50 people actually online taking this streaming live. So multiply that out by the audience we've got here, and Janet's really attracted a crowd. And I'm looking at Chantal because I think she might... No, she doesn't. There you go. That was a nice introduction to something that wasn't going to happen. Any more question up the back? Scott, thank you.
Thanks so much, Janet. It's been really great to be here and to get an insight into some of your work. I'm interested to hear, if possible, perhaps from some of these projects or some of your other work you might not have spoken about tonight, what sort of influence you're seeing from digital media coming through in really young children's writing. For instance, I'm intrigued as to whether you noticed any terms that we might associate with the digital coming through in the project that you did with Joe Bianco and the word list project, or in any other ways. I know, for example, my kids have written, and maybe we don't think about this in this way often, but written with devices and iPads, for instance, since they were very young. And I know that that's shaping their attitudes and experience of writing from quite a young age. Would you be able to perhaps give us an insight into whether or not these things are shaping the way you're thinking or what you're seeing in these young children's writing?
Not so much in the Oxford word list, but with the, if I can go back, or maybe I can't. With the very young children. The very young children that we were sort of capturing as many opportunities as we could. There's no digital here, but these young children, the 2 to 4 year old age group, were quite comfortable with different devices, with iPads, etc., in terms of their writing. So it went all the way from finger paint through to digital text. What this actually means in terms of text production, probably haven't really gone there as yet, but it will actually impact on the type of conversations that teachers have or parents have with young children as they craft or create the different texts in this space.
I noticed too that you had an example from Halo, and I wasn't sure whether that was from the computer game Halo, or if it was something else, maybe.
It was from the game. It was the child writing about the Halo troopers.
Right.
So the influence of those technologies and digital games coming through in terms of their written text as well. Yeah. It's the life worlds that are reflected in what children write.
Thanks, Scott. Any other questions? Don't be shy. Yep. Reggie's coming.
Janet, I've got to say I really appreciate the work here and the absolute rigour of it. And that's one thing that I'm interested here is the choices around methodology and why take a more quantitative approach to writing rather than a more interpretive approach. What do you think the quantitative approach helped you look at, or what did it help you see that other approaches couldn't?
I think what we were looking for, Ed, was patterns. What we wanted to be able to say is, what do Year 1 students know about writing? And to make claims around what Year 1 students know about writing, Noella and I both felt we needed a large sample to make those claims with any form of confidence. So the quantity work around this has actually been able to actually say, what do we know and how is this reflected within the sort of population of Year 1 writers? And that means that the tool that we've produced from this work sort of does resonate with teachers across Australia. So I've used it with teachers in the Kimberley. Of course, it's used in New South Wales, in Catholic education schools in Melbourne. So I think the larger numbers, Ed, have allowed us to sort of think more broadly about what it is Year 1 students can do. And then the tool across those different dimensions and across the 6 levels of the progressions actually captures that variance. If you look at the tool itself, you know, the level 1 through to level 6, there's just such a vast difference there in terms of what children can actually produce and create. And I think if we had have kept it to, say, 30 or 50 or 100 samples even, we probably wouldn't have achieved or had evidence of that breadth.
And Janet, just where to now? Where
to now? I'm thinking more about drawing and children's early writing progressions. Particularly, I think, in terms of, you know, the current NAPLAN results, particularly at Year 3 and Year 5. Is there something that we can do earlier on to support children in terms of writing development? And what are the links between those early mark-making signs, I guess, that children create, their drawing, and how does that support their progression through to writing?
Thanks, Ed. Anyone else? Yep. Chantal, is this an online question, Chantal?
Oh dear.
I was saying earlier there were about 40 or 50 people online and there's likely to be a question, and here it is.
Okay, so Janet, we've got from Louise online. So she's saying that it was a very informative presentation and she was very interested in your use of conversation with educators. So did you notice changes in their patterns of talk over time as they used the tool?
We haven't done any longitudinal work with the tool. So to be honest, we haven't looked at patterns or change. But what we did notice was that when teachers did use the tool, their breadth of conversations was, you know, covered across authorial and secretarial aspects of writing. So we were avoiding, perhaps, or preventing the, you know, well, here's your full stop and here's your capital letter and this word needs to be spelt correctly. But longitudinally, no. But that's another area, Ed, we might look at.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Louise, online. Any more? Yep, down the front here. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Janet. my question is about, I suppose, teaching text types at school. When you mention NAPLAN, and they often have to do a persuasive, we've used the tool at our school very successfully, but one of it is to try and show teachers that a lot has to be in place before you start asking children to write particular text types, those linking the ideas and the early. So I just wondered if you could comment a bit more about text types and when they should be introduced.
I think when you think about genre or text type, it's not so much teaching a text type, but what do you want students to write about and for what purpose? So rather than teaching a text type, I often think about what's the purpose of the writing. So if they are, if you're having a teddy bear's picnic, maybe you're thinking about procedural texts, or maybe you're thinking about invitations for our youngest children. So it's about, I think, integrating it into the purpose and the function of the text, and then having the text type or the particularities around different text types come out of those experiences, possibly rather than the other way around, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Any more? Yep, over here, Anne.
Thanks, Janet, for your presentation. There's such richness in your work. I'm interested in the coming to writing and working with young children, and the notion of oral language, which you sort of you talk a little bit about in the conversations that teachers have with children, and especially with children who have English as an additional language. This idea of building a conversation and building the vocabulary and building a shared experience before children begin to write. And sometimes the idea that children write, but when they tell you about their writing, it might be a slightly different story to what they've actually written. Can you comment on that at all?
I think that goes back to some of the work with drawing, Anne. The drawing and the talking and then the writing, and if we can think more about the role of drawing and using the drawing as a stimulus for oral language to sort of perhaps capture what the children want to say in terms of the message, and then linking that into writing. I agree with you, often it becomes sort of stilted or narrow because of the less opportunities to engage with talk or drawing prior to writing. And Noella in particular has done quite a lot of work around the process around drawing and talking and moving into writing, and with our very young children as well. The drawing is the stimulus for talk, which then becomes or shapes or shifts into, well, what could you write about that?
Okay, thank you.
Any more? Okay, I'd like to thank Janet on behalf of everybody here. And I think, as you can see, with what Janet presents, the way she approaches her work, her very calm, her thoughtful, her intelligent style and approach to research illustrates the rigour that underpins what it is that she knows and is able to present, and also demonstrates why she's such a highly valued and loved member of staff. So on behalf of everybody here tonight and online, Janet, we'd like to thank you once again for giving us your time tonight and your ideas. Thank you very much.